del Pacífico y al foro La Travesía de la Reputación y presentación del RepTrack Pulse Perú 2014 que organizan nuestra Casa de Estudios y el Reputation Institute. En la primera parte de este foro tendremos 2 conferencias y una mesa redonda en las que se tratará el tema de la reputación corporativa, y en la segunda parte se darán a conocer los resultados del estudio de reputación corporativa RepTrack Pulse Perú 2014. Para dar inicio al programa de hoy, me gustaría invitar a nuestro rector, el profesor Felipe Portocarrero, para que les dé el mensaje de bienvenida.
Muchas gracias, Cecilia. Ilustres invitados, profesor Charles von Brunn, bueno, antiguo profesor, former professor. 3 cosas. La primera, relacionada con la trayectoria de la Universidad del Pacífico, que, como ustedes bien saben, es una institución que goza de una excelente reputación. Y esa reputación ha sido forjada a lo largo de 52 años de vida institucional, asociando nuestra formación a causas que tienen que ver con la mejora de la sociedad, del bienestar de nuestra población. Y por eso hemos sido los pioneros hace 20 y pico años en un tema como el de la responsabilidad social, cuando en ese momento se hablaba, pocos la practicaban, por supuesto, y muchos la desconocían. La segunda cosa tiene que ver con el propio concepto de reputación. Si uno forzara la semántica, diría que la reputación está asociada también al prestigio. Y diría, incluso forzando un poco más, a la legitimidad de las organizaciones. Sean estas de diverso tipo, educativas, de servicios en general, o productivas. Porque la reputación es una construcción, no viene dado en el ADN de una organización. Ahí he leído una entrevista a Charles, en donde dice que hay muchas empresas que fracasan, y que lo más difícil de conseguir es reconstruir, ¿no es cierto?, el prestigio y la reputación que alguna vez tuvieron. Y digo esto porque, finalmente, se trata de una construcción esforzada de los miembros de una organización, lograr obtener ese reconocimiento de terceros, porque eso es la reputación. Es un concepto, diría yo, relacional. Uno no se vuelve prestigioso o adquiere reputación solo porque se la atribuye a sí mismo. Eso sería demasiado fácil. Sino porque otros perciben en uno, en la organización, esos atributos, esas características que la hacen destacable y distinguida. Por último, el tercer asunto que quería abordar en esta breve bienvenida es el relativo a la alianza que hemos establecido entre la Universidad del Pacífico y el Reputation Institute. Para nosotros es muy grato y además, como buenos académicos y universitarios, esperamos sacar el mejor provecho de este vínculo, porque aquí tenemos, he visto a nuestro ex vicedecano de marketing, al decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Empresariales, y para nosotros el vínculo con el instituto es enormemente potente, porque nos va a permitir tener material de primera mano para que nuestros estudiantes elaboren investigaciones, produzcan artículos y desarrollen su propia creatividad e intuición. De manera que, por donde uno lo mire, es muy grato para mí darles la bienvenida a todos ustedes, a nuestros invitados que vienen de España y de diversas partes, a nuestros socios también locales, y en fin, darles a todos la bienvenida y agradecerles mucho su presencia. Gracias.
A continuación escucharemos la conferencia magistral The Reputation Journey, Pratfalls and Pitfalls, Sights and Sounds, a cargo del señor Charles von Brunn, fundador y presidente del Reputation Institute. Charles von Brunn ha sido profesor en el Stern School of Business de la Universidad de Nueva York y en la Wharton School de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Es autor de numerosos artículos y libros, incluyendo el bestseller pionero en su campo, Reputation, Realizing Value from the Corporate Image, y es creador de los sistemas de gestión de la reputación actualmente utilizados por numerosas compañías en el mundo. Señor von Brunn, adelante, por favor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Frommer, and I'm delighted to be with you today. I have to thank you for being here, but I do have to ask you, given the lack of applause, I know the answer. Why are you here? Did you come here to hear me because you knew about me? How many of you did? You can raise your hands. 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, 15. Don't worry, I won't be insulted. How many of you are here because you know about Reputation Institute? 1, 2, 3, maybe 2 dozen more. Good. How many of you are here because you have a relationship with Universidad del Pacífico? Come on, tell the truth. Everybody here does. You're here because of the reputation of the university for doing good things. Right? And that's why you came. During this talk of mine, you will be confirming the fact that you get quality from the Universidad del Pacífico. So I gratefully appreciate your being here. I gratefully especially appreciate the university for inviting me to speak to you. And for my colleagues at Reputation Institute and at Inmark, who are our partners here, for the session we are about to have. I have had many lives, and although you think I'm young, no, I have lived before. And my life before has been characterized by many activities. In one life, I was born in Cuba, but I only stayed there for 6 months, so I do not speak Spanish. I am very sorry, I cannot speak to you in Spanish. My apologies. But you have a good translator, I hope, and you can hear me and understand. Stop me, raise your hand, and I will slow down or go faster or repeat. In another life, I went around the world and got to live in many different countries. So my second life was international travel and exposure to many cultures. And so I've had a lot of opportunity to think about the world, especially about societies and how countries work and what institutions are. I'll reflect a little bit on that as we go through my talk today, and you'll hear that in my words. In the third life, though, I was a physicist. And I like to talk about physics when I talk about some of the things that I do. And today's conversation about reputation, you might hear me think and say things like social force. Because in fact, I think of reputation as a social force. Much like a magnet can attract, also a magnet can repulse. And reputation is a social force. It has that characteristic that it can attract and repel. And its second main characteristic, that it acts at a distance. So even though you don't know it, it's there. And it's affecting how you are, how you feel, how you think. So the importance of reputation to me has come from that thinking about reputation as a social force. But in a fourth life, I was also a sociologist. And so as a sociologist, I'll talk to you about reputation from another different point of view, which has to do with the way in which society works and the way in which reputation acts to influence social activity. And there we'll talk about the ability of social markets to play a key role in the allocation of resources. In a fifth life, I was an economist. So I will also talk about some things to do with economics. And you'll hear me say something about markets and how markets fail. So these are the sort of the points of view that you'll hear from my 5 lives. Now I hope that I have more lives to live. And maybe the 6th life has something to do with our relationship with Peru. And that we will be seeing each other more often. I hope so. Through the work that I do at Reputation Institute and with my colleagues, we hope to do much more involvement with the companies in Peru, with the institutions like the Universidad del Pacífico, and with Inmark. So, look forward to all of those things in my 6th life here. I think I have 9 lives, so more things will happen in the future. Well, let me start with life number 1. My life number 1 was in Cuba, and my life number 2 is in the world. So I like to think of my stepping back as a universe. How do you see this? It's a pretty picture, isn't it? It's a beautiful picture of the galaxy that we live in. We are somewhere, I believe, here on Earth. It's one little dot in that infinite expanse of space, the universe, the galaxy, the solar system. Our beautiful planet. As you think back, if you look, just what all that wonderful thing that is going on around you. And in fact, if I could make it do it, I have no idea how to do that with this pointer. There is a little, I might get it to work. It even rotates. And the rotation of that planet is so beautiful. It creates many, many of the forces that are shaping. Oh, what happened to it? So much for technology. That happened to it. But the rotation ends, and we end up here in fact, I think you're right here, no? Somewhere around there, Lima, in Peru. And look at that beautiful world. Great, gorgeous. Look at the beautiful world that it creates when you get closer, as you start to go down, down, closer to the earth. Beautiful cascades, beautiful ocean, a beautiful beach, gorgeous settings, mountains. All of this richness of nature, the bounty of nature that we are given and gifted with. And then people. At some point along the track, people came into the picture. Right? And we started to do things to the planet, to that planet that we're looking at that has been around for thousands and billions of years. Right? And all those faces, all those people get to work. And the work that they start to do creates beautiful things, adds to nature. So we have empires like the Inca left us in Machu Picchu. We have the pyramids that the Egyptians left us outside of Cairo. We have the monuments of the Taj Mahal. We have Russia's Red Square. We have Venice left to us by the Italians. And we have New York, created by numerous architects. The Eiffel Tower in Paris. And Palm Island in Dubai, most recently. So, beautiful things created by us humans on this planet, inside this big universe and galaxy that we live in. That wealth that is represented by that physical and that natural capital has been talked about as the wealth of nations. And the wealth of nations is influenced, has been created by 3 key guys who have explained to us, look how they look. All have little beards and mustaches. But they were intellectuals. They were thinkers. They belonged in universities. And they were thinking about problems of society, and they were thinking about what makes for growth, what makes for economic growth, what makes for the creation of wealth for a country like Peru, like the United States, and the world as a whole. And I like to think about these 3 thinkers because, in fact, the first one, Adam Smith, is the one who wrote about markets. And he told us that if you let people do what they do naturally and they pursue their self-interest, they will create the best possible allocation of resources through the marketplace. There is an invisible hand that will move resources around with no one person or one organization guiding it to create that wealth. And if we let it happen properly, it will create the most wealth. A second guy, a little later on, Frederick Taylor, wrote about specialization. And he picked up on the ideas of Adam Smith, and he said, wow, if we specialize ourselves in the work that we do, if we pursue the division of labor, we will create more efficiency in the system than if one person did everything all by themselves. So that's really a reason why in business we study these people, because they teach us about the importance of specialization and the importance of the evolution of specialization through the division of labor into the marketplace. And of course, markets are what have made so much possible, and they've made it possible in Peru. Matilda was telling me last night, wonderful conversation about how Peru has opened up in the last decade. And it's true, I was here 10 years ago, and it's a new Peru that I'm seeing. So the opening of markets, the opening of the exchange processes between people made possible wealth. The third guy, Max Weber, interesting guy. How many of you have heard of him? Important sociologist and thinker, because what he said was, all this is very good, but none of it will create that wealth unless organizations rise to manage it. And so he recognized that the problem of large-scale wealth will not happen, or the possibilities of large-scale wealth will not happen unless organizations rise to manage it. So he explained the rise of the large corporation. Okay? And because he explained the rise of the large corporation, we saw many new bureaucracies and organizations created, and the structure of our modern companies derives very much from the work that he wrote about. So here we are, markets, division of labor, we've built wealth, and all is set to go with our big organizations running things. What happens? Well, we observe it. You observe the division of labor that produces factories. The factories through mass production, right, that make for efficient and scale of operations. What rises in parallel? Mass transportation to move the goods that are mass produced through the market. Mass transportation and shipping across oceans and lakes. Mass assembly. Mass storage. Of course, mass agriculture. All those big things that are happening as we get all the conveniences of the car that enables us to move around, the plane that enables us to travel from one place to another, the supermarket that enables us to receive all of those products that are being made by all those factories and mass operations. Right? All sounds familiar? The story of our century. All right, the story of the ideas from Adam Smith to Max Weber. But what do we choose to do as part of that mass organization of mass production, mass distribution, and mass consumption? We make tobacco out of those nice big rich fields that can create also products. We start to sell hamburgers and French fries that are made in very fatty products. That is not cocaine. This is sugar. We put sugar in everything. Plastic becomes a product of the chemical industry that has such enduring properties that it, of course, does not disintegrate. Okay? And what is the result? We create mass piles of garbage that cannot be disposed of naturally because they do not disintegrate. They're not biodegradable. We create and upset the atmosphere through the drawing of energy resources from the ground that burn petroleum and that create problems in the ozone layer. That leads to tsunamis. And of course, we don't share the wealth very equally because the entrepreneurs who start the companies hold on to the capital, hold on to the profits, become richer, and the poor become poorer, and there's an increasing inequality. So poverty and inequality arise. So all of these beautiful things that came on our planet also become now the things that create all the problems that we see today. Our markets and our organizations are failing. They are failing us. So it is in this context that economists talk about the externalities of production. The externalities that businesses do not incorporate into their calculations when they make business decisions. So the vast realm of economics talks about the failures of markets. The failures of markets because they do not deliver the most beneficial outcomes for society. Some are great. They do great things, like we saw. They build beautiful things. They create possibilities and wealth. But the wealth is not always distributed equally. And there are many external factors that are not taken into account in their calculations. So, of course, we are faced then with pollution. We are faced with degradation of the environment. We're faced with companies that perhaps experience oil spills more regularly than others. We're faced with dramatic disaster, crises, scandal, problems. And hence, the sociologists who talk back to you and tell you, and I'm wearing my sociological hat, that has to be controlled. Markets cannot be allowed to operate by themselves. We have to control them, and we have to control them through regulation. Right? So that's when in certain countries in particular, government regulation comes in to say, we must not allow this to happen. You markets are failing, you companies are failing us, we have to do something about it. So then you see the government regulation. The industry tends to respond by saying, let's just regulate ourselves better. Right? So industry associations come about and say, let's put regulations in place to prevent these things from happening and to create a mechanism of control that will prevent outcomes such as what we see. Well, we have observed now for maybe 60, 70 years of experiences across different countries around the world, the negative effects of government regulation on industry, the difficulty of managing that, and we've observed the negative effects of self-regulation, the next to impossible task that companies face when they try to self-regulate. Okay, there's a cheater mentality, there's a conflict that's inherently there to cheat, because one, if you're in an industry, one can incrementally move and take advantage of a situation. So that leaves us with the idea of institutional control. And institutional control is about having institutions around companies that maybe influence and pressure them to behave correctly. Well, let me suggest to you an interpretation of reputation as this form of institutional control. Because where does it come from? It comes from the stakeholder groups that are around companies and that can say, I don't think you're doing the right thing. I don't think you should be doing it this way. This is how we think because this is how we feel and this is how we would like you to behave. Reputation is an external form of institutional control that can very much help to mitigate the externalities and market failures that we observe. Are you with me? You follow this slide? It's a very powerful issue because it makes reputation much more than something trivial like the word image. I do not use the word image very often because I think it has been made very, very, very useless in conversation. An image is too fluffy. It's something that you look at but you don't really touch. Whereas reputation is that hard thing. It's the evaluation that you make of what a company stands for and what a company does. Okay, and I think the reputation marketplace is what I'd like you to think about as the conversation for tonight. Let me start by telling you what this new economics that I think we're in, which is this reputational marketplace, has to do. We started with Adam Smith's economics. Right? This was the profile that Adam Smith suggested was appropriate in the markets. Small, powerless buyers and sellers, perfect information flowing about prices and about the quality of goods that are being sold by the sellers of those goods, moral behavior on the part of all the actors. In other words, I don't take advantage of you. I pay you what I think is worth. You ask me what to pay and I pay it. Okay? If that's a marketplace, that's the way we operate. And the focus on investment capital as driving the market. If you have capital, you hire labor, you make products, and you sell them. Okay? The new economics looks like this. It recognizes that the actors in our society and in our markets are not powerless, but they are typically very big, and they have considerable resources and clout, They try to influence what's happening in the world and influence you to think about it. And they are not just companies, they're also stakeholder groups. There are unions that represent workers. There are associations that represent industries. There are associations that represent specific communities. So there are all kinds of big actors that have their own bases of power. Okay? And that is part of the change in the economics of the marketplace. Two others. Instead of perfect information, we know that markets are characterized by asymmetry. Asymmetry means if I'm a producer of a product, I know what goes into it. But if you're the buyer, you probably don't. So there's asymmetric information about what's in there, and much of the theory in economics, especially game theory, imagines that I spend money on advertising, for instance, in order to give you information about what I really put into my products. So the advertising expense is an expense in building reputation. It's an expense in building reputation so that you trust me. Right? Similarly, you come to school. You're at a university. Why do you choose to invest in coming to school? Because you want to signal organizations, companies, institutions that you are a high-quality potential employee. So you invest in education to signal to the market that you are deserving of higher pay. So you're building your own reputations by coming to the Universidad del Pacífico. So reputation is a process that markets are observing. Moral behavior. Well, we've observed that there is not much moral behavior in our markets. I think we know that. In fact, most economists now talk about the nature of opportunistic behavior as an important component of modeling the behavior of markets. Because people are out for their own self-interest, but they're not just doing it to make a little bit more. They want to take as much as they can. Right? So the opportunistic behavior means I'm going to take advantage of a situation. And we observe that to be the case in enormous, in very, very, very natural circumstances perhaps, but in all markets. Finally, the importance of the new model is that it says it's not about investment capital only, it's about social capital. The social capital that's created from having good relationships with the communities and with the other stakeholder groups that you relate to. Okay, so that's the nature of the new model. And what it suggests is that the hand is no longer so much invisible as it is a very visible hand. The very visible hand of organizations, institutions, stakeholders who are trying to influence outcomes. Oops, sorry. Now, there are some evidence that I'll bring to bear on this. The evidence is pretty clear from the financial markets that we have gone through some dramatic changes over time. This is the stock market price for those who have finance in your blood. 1962, the stock market values were over here. This is the Standard & Poor's 500 index. Okay? You see that post-war, all the way up to the, maybe let's say early 80s, was pretty steady. Nothing was going on in the market values of companies overall. What happened, though, that these were powerful companies doing all the mass market, mass distribution, mass consumption activities. But they weren't balanced much in power. They were running the show. This is when all the big companies you read about in all the business case studies that you probably do, this is when they grew up. Right? And they grew up by taking power and doing all those things that we talked about as being negative outcomes or market failures. What happened in the 80s to mid-90s was the rise of something that now governs our lives. Right? The internet, the cell phone, the smartphone, the exchange of information that overcomes imperfect situations by giving us access to data, giving us access to information that gives us the ability to influence outcomes more quickly. How many of you are on Facebook? Okay, you have to put your hand up. Come on. Admit it. Admit it. You aren't fair. How many of you are tweeting on Twitter? Okay, I'm not going to count. It's universal, right? It has taken over our lives. It's the rise of the connective technologies. The connective technologies that connect us to each other, that connect us to information. How many times you say, oh, I forgot, how does that work? Oh, let me look it up on Google. I have to look up, what was the actor in that movie? What was it? Everything is on Google. In fact, Google is now, the universal storehouse or library of the world. So, connective technologies have enabled things to change dramatically and have led us to the point where in the early 90s we were seeing a rise in value, but the beginnings of something dramatic. And what do you see here? Since 1995 to 2013, dramatic rise in valuations, but also spikes, ups and downs, right? And this is where I think you see the enormous change that has taken place. It is the power of stakeholders, those powerful institutions that are now pushing value up and down. Okay? Because they're fighting the interpretations that are being made by companies. So it's not a uniform action on the part of powerful companies. It's a countervailing power that is shaping the marketplace. So it's in this marketplace that we are now looking at reputation. And looking at reputation as a powerful source. So in that brave new world, I like to say, perceptions are controlling the marketplace. It's not what you say. It's how others trust you and believe in you. We used to use the word brand to say that stuff. Although brand has been used to say many things, okay? Brand really is about the communication metaphor. The reason I think reputation has become an interesting word for us to use is because it is fundamentally about how the others see you. How the world is seeing you as a company. Are you doing the right things to them? Are they expecting from you what you think you are delivering? And if there's not a match, you will lose reputation status. That's the fundamental difference between a branding approach to a lot of the work that we do versus a reputation approach that says you start by listening. So managers are no longer in control of value. What you'll observe is the fact that on the balance sheets of most companies now, that simple equation, value of the company, how much of it you can count versus how much you can't count. Okay? The composition of the assets of most companies in 1975 was 83% physical assets. You could actually count them up. And that's why we had accountants, because they were very busy counting. Now what's happened to accountants over the years? You can see it. They become less relevant. Why? Because they're counting, they're trying to count, but they can't come up with a number because 81% of the value of companies is now intangible. So they have a hard time measuring the things that really matter. The things that really matter being all of the intangible assets. So the capital, the wealth of our companies, the wealth of our nations, is increasingly embedded in the goodwill or the reputations that people have of them. As finance, in your finance course, I'm sure you've talked about what is the present value of future money. And then you say, well, what's the discount rate you apply? And then, well, it's expectations about the future that drive that. So the present value is based on your future expectations of getting something. Well, what are those future expectations? Perceptions. Perceptions that are influenced by all the things in the marketplace that are moving around. And of course, that's why this is there. This is actually true, and that hand that I'd like to show is moving from that visible to the invisible, is moving invisible to the visible again here. Right? Because in fact, it's hidden assets, but manipulated by visible hands of stakeholders and companies that are all struggling to influence value. Now, let's look at the number across countries. The value of intangibles, the percent of the total value of the companies in the U.S., 68%. 50% overall, 6% in Japan. So you see a wide range of numbers, but very heavily in the category of high numbers. You can do that analysis across industries, and you can do that analysis across companies in the same way. This is what we call the reputation economy. It's the economy in which intangibles dominate the assets of companies, in which the value you have depends on, it just won't stay by itself. In which people buy, the value that you have depends on the trust and admiration and appreciation, which is what we mean by reputation. It depends on the reputation you have with those people. And that's where value comes from. And that's why we now live in a reputation economy. In that reputation economy, as companies, you have to think differently. Because you have to think not about the market push strategy, which comes from the brand metaphor, but you have to think about the expressive methodology, which is I express myself to engage with my stakeholders in order to achieve the outcomes that I want. And all that is changing, in part through social media, but in part through all of the social institutions that make it possible for us to have relationships with companies. And those relationships are crucial for the future marketing activities of the firm. Let me try and play this. Bear with me. There's a volume.
Could this bottle actually be harmful?
Forced labor, dangerous environments.
People trust companies less and less. They do not believe companies. They do not believe CEOs. They do not believe advertisers.
Corporations made a mess, and they covered it up with these slick advertising campaigns. People started seeing the reality behind these images, and they were pissed off.
Companies are becoming more and more transparent whether they like it or not.
There are 2.5 billion searches conducted on Google every day. There is more video uploaded to YouTube in a month than the major TV networks broadcast in the last 60 years.
Traditional advertising, I think, is finished.
You would think that companies, knowing their products are being reviewed and talked about, would encourage them to make better products. There's still a lot of crap out there. Trust
Something
me.
is up, man.
Being a great company is the new brand.
The definition of advertising has to evolve. Companies have to shift away from just saying they're great to actually being great.
Image is reality. What you see is what you get.
Rather than spend a lot of money on paid advertising, instead, let's take most of that money and invest it into customer experience.
Let's create a platform so that our consumers can bring to life what they want and their passion. People would hug me. I've never been hugged for any work that I've ever done in my. I barely get hugged at home.
We all know the planet is under pressure. One company is not going to change it. It needs to be many companies, and we can start a movement, get more companies on board. Yes, we can have a very meaningful impact on the planet.
The best merchants are the ones who dictate the future, not the ones who are trying to predict the future.
To the skeptics, continue to be skeptics, because I'm going to go change business. You guys do what you want to do.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened to this video. It tried to explain to you the idea that really there's less and less trust and the points we've been making, and that people are no longer trusting companies and need to get in front of them more aggressively. So stakeholder capitalism, reputational capitalism is here for us. The things that are important under this model is the difference between pushing your products and being relevant with the products that you make to the consumer. Relevant to the society, relevant to the stakeholders. The things that matter are not a monologue where you speak about things, but you establish a dialogue with the stakeholder groups. When I first worked with a company called Shell Oil in the mid-90s, they had an approach to the world that was all about, we do this, the rest of the world reacts. They changed that. They changed that and they talked about listening as the important part of their challenge as a company. Less about authority and more about authenticity. You don't just authoritatively make statements, you try to establish that you are authentic with the messages you are making. to the constituencies you're dealing with. You don't develop so much messages as you establish conversations with your stakeholder communities. That's rule number 1. So it leads me to ask the question, well, who is succeeding in the reputation economy? Since we have now been in it for almost a decade, what's going on? We've been studying this using all kinds of data from market research that we do in different countries around the world, including Peru. And we continuously have found that the winning companies come from those that build strong emotional bonds with their stakeholders. They engage. And they engage with them on 3 levels. The 3 levels are, they do the right things, first of all. There's no way you can get away with being well-regarded and not do it right. So you have to do the right things. They also do good things. So yes, they are often socially responsible companies who at least invest behind platforms that show them to be doing good things in society and in the communities in which they operate. They also, of course, do well. They have to deliver financial performance and profitability because that's the basis on which they are judged by the financial communities. So they do 3 things very well. They do it right, they do it well, and they do good. And that's the basis on which reputations, strong ones, are built. They're also built on openness, authenticity, and transparency. Over and over we find that the highest rated companies are those that convey the message and convey it in a way that says, I'm not a clothes shop, I am here to be seen. Here I am. And they don't step out necessarily naked, but much less clothed in the obscure clothing that used to characterize companies in the past. So they do good works. And the book by Philip Kotler, for instance, highlights the corporate initiatives that build a better world and the bottom line. And we talk about that link, that virtuous link between all good, doing good activity and the bottom line, all reputation building activities and the bottom line. One way they do this is by helping and showing that they are helping to solve fundamental social problems. So companies that are creating problems, remember the market failures side, they created the social problems, or they contributed to them, are now also trying to help solve them. And if the weight of solution is greater than the weight of causation, then there is an improvement in your reputation. So to what extent are the activities and initiatives adequate? Are they the right ones? And you can ask yourselves that, those of you who are working in companies or thinking about other companies, they are not always the right things. You hear about companies that are doing good by giving money away. Philanthropy has seldom been a very good outcome because philanthropy does not necessarily lead to any solution. It does not associate the company with the solution to the problems that were caused. So having a much closer relationship between the fundamental social problem and that can help. This is a little study about storytelling that was in the Harvard Business Review a little while ago. And I thought it was interesting because it talked about the difference between what they call storytelling, companies that just tell stories about themselves, communications in other words, versus story doing. Story doing being the launching of initiatives that are addressing social problems. It's kind of interesting to see that in social media, since so many of you are interested in social media, in those years, the story-doing companies got a lot more mentions because they're perceived as more authentic, more real, more connected to their stakeholder words. Yeah? In our terminology, a good reputation works because it generates support from all of your stakeholder groups. It generates supports for you as people who are considering jobs, perhaps. It generates that likelihood that you'll want to work for them if you see a good reputation or hear a good reputation. It's likely that you'll want to invest in it if you're a trader or an investor. It's likely that you'll want to lend to it if you're a bank. And it's likely that you'll want to be a part of the community that that company is in if you're just in the neighborhood. We see this to be consistent because most of the people would recommend those companies when they have higher reputations. Oops. When you look globally, companies and industries have been improving over time. And that's very good in some countries. It's not, so here this is a total of the number of improving companies in reputation in the UK. They're the ones that have most improved. In our database of 1,400 companies. In the US, improvements. In Germany, in Italy. I don't have the data for Peru, unfortunately. But you see at the other extreme of this chart how falling reputations in Spain over the last 6-7 years of this analysis. Denmark has fallen, Canada has fallen, Ireland has fallen, Switzerland. So there is a shuffling that's taking place in the companies that are rising versus the companies that are falling. It's also true across industries. If you look at that same group broken down by industries, you'll see that the most improved have been transportation and logistics. So that's interesting. Airlines. We don't really think so most of the time, but airlines have been doing better. In other words, we're rating them better because in part they're making efforts at investing in their infrastructures. Services, etc. The ones that have most fallen, banks. We all hate banks. Sorry for the banks. But not always. You're going to hear that there are some exceptions. And I think maybe in Peru's case, that will be an exception. But in the United States, it has dramatically fallen. In Spain, it has dramatically fallen. And so you've seen a huge transformation of the banking sector in the last decade. Some are rising, but many are not. I picked a certain set of the highest growth, the highest rises between those 6 years in which we've measured reputations. And you'll see one, Cobham. Do you know what Cobham is? Anybody? No? Very unknown, right? But it has one of the strongest rises in reputation from the activity it does. It actually makes defense gear, like those people who go out into the military field, they have to wear helmets and all that stuff, the protective gear. They're a big maker of that. Another one is Statoil from Norway. It has had almost no change in reputation in those 6-7 years. And the last one is the biggest drop. Okay? I'll say a few words about each one of those, just to see if there's any pattern. Okay? Cobham has this characteristic, makes all kinds of things. But what I thought was most interesting is this statement that it makes right here. At Cobham, we recognize that acting responsibly and sustainably creates value for our stakeholders. This is not a common thing to see in a business-to-business type of organization, talking about stakeholders and sustainability and social responsibility. Okay? So I think it's interesting to see that part. And they have been the strongest improvers, so even in that world, they come across as responsible. Danske Bank, the biggest drop, talks about firing, getting rid of its CEO, ousting its treasury, and doing it very publicly. And of course, it leads to dramatic decline in perceptions and appreciation for the company. Okay? And then finally, Statoil, Helge Lund, its CEO, had this to say. It's an oil company. Stakeholder interests, risks, and opportunities are deeply integrated in every business decision that we make. And what we're talking about there is the amount of commitment they make to their stakeholders and their dialogue with those stakeholders. And I think that's the continuous part of the story that I've had to tell you tonight, is that the relationship between companies and their stakeholders is crucial. Unilever had this to say, and I think it's a nice statement. We missed the issue of obesity and the value of healthy and nutritional food. We were behind while Nestle was riding the wave. Okay? Not being in tune with the society, with the benefit of hindsight, can cost you dearly. So connecting yourself to stakeholder needs and stakeholder expectations is crucial. And Unilever is now doing it, as is Procter & Gamble, as are many of our largest companies. Let me stop the story there and tell you that it's not just about companies, although we are mostly focused on our company dialogue today and tonight. It's also about countries, because countries and cities and regions worry about very similar things. They worry about whether they can attract the support of all of their stakeholders. Why? Because they want to increase tourism. Peru wants to have more tourists come every year. They want to increase their exports. You want to send it abroad. Why? Because it brings in foreign resources that enable you to do more things and attract investment and attract talent. So the question I'd like to leave you with is certainly the idea that countries and cities also have reputations and also have to worry about saying and doing the right things, engaging in the right ways so that they are part of a reputational market that enhances their value. You're going to hear more about that from the next presenter in a few minutes. I want to end on the notion of the reputation journey that was the title of my talk. I gave you a long preamble around it, but the reputation journey is what we observe all companies to be on, whether small, medium, or large. Whether you're a neighborhood mom-and-pop grocery store or salon operator or pharmacy, you have to worry about thinking of reputation. And the very first stage of any company that we've encountered is this exploration. What is reputation? What is my reputation doing to me? Does it help me? Does it hurt me? How do I understand it? The growth of that journey is in moving from there to building a framework for measurement, because if you say it matters, you have to measure it. If it's not being measured, you're not going to be able to manage it. So the logic is to move from understanding to measurement, management, integration inside the company, and here the bigger you are, the more important it becomes to you to worry about managing across silos, to the point where you're now making investments that are based heavily on reputation thinking. That is, how will it affect how stakeholders understand me? How will it affect favorable or unfavorable perceptions of me? Okay. When we do the study with 500 large companies or reputation managers, we found that the sample of people responding tell us that 15% of those companies are at that early stage. 38% are in a more advanced stage. 1% have achieved the full integration stage. So there's a ways to go, even for the largest companies, which this sample represents from around the world. Okay. Let me leave you with one last little video, if I can get it to play properly.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know?
It's a machine. It's not.
And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Nail is on her head, and the point of the video is, she says, "Stop it, don't try and tell me what about this." And he's trying to tell her, "But listen, you have a nail inside your head, we need to remove it." She says, "Stop it, you're intervening against it." And then she finally ends the video with trying to kiss her because he's listening, and it hits his forehead and hurts him even more. So the point of it is, the power of listening means you have to stop talking in order to hear what your stakeholders are saying. And it's a fun video. I'm sorry that the crowd couldn't get it through. Muchas gracias. I mentioned that you would be hearing more from country brands, and our next speaker will be talking about that. And I think later on we'll be hearing about measurement more in detail. So stand by for that. Thank you.
Gerente Inmark Estudios y Estrategias, quien nos va a presentar la conferencia El Made in, los territorios también se venden. Señor Gorga, por favor.
Buenas tardes a todos. Yo voy a explicar de alguna manera la relación que existe entre la reputación de los territorios y los beneficios económicos que aportan precisamente una buena gestión de la reputación. Lo voy a hacer desde una perspectiva muy poco académica, con algunos ejemplos, y desde una perspectiva de una experiencia personal y de nuestra compañía, donde, y me permito la cuña publicitaria, somos muy buenos en la gestión del desarrollo territorial y el marketing territorial. Bien, Hace 3 años el Papa, el anterior, Benedicto, sacó un disco, Alma Mater. La pregunta que cabría hacerse es cómo es posible que el Papa comparta el mismo sello discográfico con Sex Pistols o Justin Bieber o Guns N' Roses. Es exactamente el mismo. ¿Por qué? Porque la institución probablemente más conservadora de la Tierra ha entendido que tiene que transmitir su mensaje, tiene que acercarse a los nuevos públicos a través de nuevas fórmulas de comunicación. Así, este Papa se inauguró con disco propio, participó en un reality en la televisión italiana y inauguró también una presencia de los papas en las redes sociales. Si la institución más conservadora de la Tierra entiende que es necesario, en el mundo que estamos actualmente, cambiar nuestra mentalidad y entender que todo territorio, todo bien, requiere ser vendido, requiere ser comunicado y requiere generar un impacto, una buena reputación, si queremos conseguir los fines que estamos buscando, deberíamos entender y deberíamos aprender que los territorios, los destinos, como bienes comunes que son de todos los ciudadanos, también debe realizarse. ¿En qué ha cambiado nuestro mundo en los últimos, yo diría, 20 años? Bueno, básicamente hemos pasado de una economía productiva y una economía donde también de alguna manera es importante la sensibilidades que vamos creciendo. Hemos visto crecer, por ejemplo, en relación a la responsabilidad social corporativa, en relación a temas de calidad, en relación a temas de medio ambiente, a una economía que al mismo tiempo tiene unas características muy particulares que yo defino como la economía del microondas. Todo es rápido, todo es inmediato. Hoy en día hemos sido capaces de ver una guerra en directo a través de la televisión. Ahora mismo los comentarios de esta conferencia se están retuiteando. Prácticamente hoy la gente espera un cierto nivel o capacidad de respuesta de las compañías de manera inmediata, de transparencia, y esto también es aplicable exactamente a los territorios. Cuando hablamos de territorios, hablamos, entre otras cosas, del conjunto también de compañías, aparte, por supuesto, de las instituciones que lo conforman. Y es cierto que si queremos ser un país, digamos así, potencialmente importante, un país que sea capaz de atraer inversión, un país que cuente en el marco internacional, también tenemos que empezar a entender que ya no se trabaja, ya no se discute, ya no se pelea en ligas locales. Estamos trabajando en un mundo globalizado y en una liga totalmente global. Otra de las cosas importantes que han ido cambiando en estos años es el valor de lo tangible y lo intangible. Escasamente en los años 80, el 85% de los activos de las empresas eran activos tangibles. Hoy en día esta versión se ha cambiado. Prácticamente estamos hablando de que prácticamente el 85% de los activos están en valores intangibles. Muchas de las grandes marcas que conocemos, desde Nike, HP, etcétera, son marcas que ya no producen productos. Son marcas que hacen puro marketing, que definen estilos de vida y que producen soluciones que más o menos le pueden interesar al ciudadano. Y este nivel ha permitido, como antes también comentaba el anterior ponente, que las principales marcas del mercado, las 100 principales, tienen un valor consolidado de 2.000 millones de dólares, que es bastante importante. Desde el punto de vista de los destinos, hace algunos años se hablaba del concepto de destino sostenible, un concepto que es muy amplio, pero que es un concepto que yo defino como un concepto preventivo. Este ha ido evolucionando con el paso de los tiempos a lo que se llaman los destinos de calidad, que son destinos que ofrecen ventajas competitivas claras a los ciudadanos, a los visitantes, ventajas comparativas, que ofrecen condiciones de vida especiales y productividad, pero todavía es más. Con el advenimiento de la tecnología estamos empezando a hablar de lo que se llaman los destinos inteligentes. Los destinos inteligentes serán probablemente en la próxima década uno de los grandes hitos dentro del marketing territorial. Y luego, por supuesto, también hay una evolución en todo lo que tiene que ver en la reputación, la marca, la imagen. Antes hablábamos de marcas y este recorrido, pasando precisamente por el cumplimiento, el atendimiento correcto de esas sensibilidades sociales, desde el punto de vista medioambiental, de responsabilidad social corporativa, de cumplimiento con la sociedad, ha ido o está evolucionando hacia el modelo de reputación. Para mí, desde una perspectiva, como antes dije, muy poco académica, me gusta comparar el tema de reputación con la huella de carbono. O sea, al final, cuando queremos evaluar el comportamiento ambiental de mi empresa, muchas veces utilizamos una serie de métricas, incluso certificamos nuestros procesos de servicio para demostrar que somos una empresa medioambiental importante, que nos tomamos conciencia del impacto que tenemos, pero hay un indicador definitivo que es la huella de carbono, es el rastro que dejamos en el planeta. De igual modo, la reputación probablemente es un indicador, primero, sintético de todo lo que tiene que ver con la imagen, la capacidad, el atractivo de los destinos, de los territorios, y también, y esto es muy importante, es un indicador estructural. Esto quiere decir que no está sometido, probablemente, o de una manera totalmente directa, a vaivenes o a ciertas situaciones concretas que se puedan presentar en un momento determinado y a las que a veces, bueno, muy frecuentemente, los destinos no saben reaccionar. Porque la competencia, antes decía, es global. Ahora mismo, aunque el mapa mundial cambia constantemente, estamos hablando de 197 países, más o menos 2 millones de municipios, más o menos 400.000 territorios. Todos estos aspiran a tener un huequecito en el mundo. Desde el punto de vista territorial, Perú, con sus 25 departamentos, con sus 1.800 municipalidades, tiene que competir en este mercado. Y los competidores de Perú ya no son nuestros vecinos. Probablemente nuestros competidores, cuando PROMPERÚ hace sus estudios de mercado, no se compara solamente con otros destinos de Latinoamérica, sino que se compara con destinos que están en Asia, con destinos que están en Oriente Medio, que venden productos y tienen una vocación parecida a la que tiene Perú en el mercado hoy en día. Estamos hablando de que es una tarta que, a pesar de que crece la oferta, también crece la demanda de una manera exponencial. Hoy en día estamos hablando de 1,1 billones de turistas, estamos hablando de 1,8 trillones en inversiones que nos estamos jugando, estamos hablando desde el punto de vista turístico, que es en la tercera parte del comercio mundial de servicios. O sea, estamos hablando de sectores con una dinámica que ya escapa a todo lo que podamos imaginar. Y hay territorios que de por sí solos, a nivel ciudad o a nivel regional, han tenido o han desarrollado una capacidad de generación dentro del Producto Interior Bruto bastante importante. Pongamos Silicon Valley en Estados Unidos o territorios similares que se están desarrollando en España. Les podría poner un ejemplo también de, para mí, uno de los que es más paradigmáticos y además me gusta porque ha salido en una de las diapositivas, que es el ejemplo de Euro Disney. Euro Disney, que al final no deja de ser un proyecto de destino vacacional recreativo, representa un paradigma porque, por citarles algunos datos, responde a el gancho de un gran proyecto de desarrollo territorial que se realizó en una región anexa a París, que estaba en una situación de declive, o sea, no se escogió el destino por azar. El proyecto de Euro Disney es un proyecto que aproximadamente ha recaudado ahora mismo unos 50.000 millardos de dólares en gasto turístico desde que se puso en marcha. Y es un proyecto que se planificó a 30 años vista, que ha generado 45.000 puestos de trabajo, que ha traído 60.000 nuevos visitantes, que ha generado todo un polo de industrias vinculadas a las tecnologías limpias que están todas alrededor precisamente de Euro Disney. O sea, no es un proyecto recreativo. Y incluso desde el punto de vista recreativo, hoy en día Euro Disney es el primer destino de toda Francia. Para que se hagan una idea, sobre más o menos unos 16 millones de visitantes que tiene al año, el siguiente monumento más visitado de toda Francia es el Louvre de París, con aproximadamente 9 millones, y las cifras de ahora mismo de Euro Disney aproximadamente son idénticas que las que recibe París, con la sola diferencia de que Euro Disney, solo el 15% de los visitantes que van a Euro Disney visita también París. O sea, Euro Disney se ha convertido en un destino, en un polo de atracción por sí solo, al igual que lo es en otros países, y París también lo es. Conjuntamente, esos dos destinos representan aproximadamente el 85% del negocio turístico de toda Francia. Como pueden ver, las cifras son bastante interesantes, ¿no? ¿Qué ocurre? Que en este mundo globalizado es cierto que hay algunas economías, como son las europeas, las de los países, vamos a decir, primeros, Estados Unidos, etcétera, donde hoy en día nuestro principal objetivo, nuestro principal problema es intentar mantenernos. Desde el punto de vista de estas segundas economías emergentes, como es el caso de Perú, las posibilidades de crecimiento son infinitas, son importantes, pero también las posibilidades de crecimiento desde una perspectiva sostenible y, sobre todo, de una perspectiva que genere una buena reputación, también es muy importante porque es lo que va a sustentar un sólido futuro. Otro de los aspectos que hay veces que no tenemos excesivamente claro es que el concepto reputación no tiene que ver necesariamente con la relevancia económica. Antes estábamos diciendo que hay destinos o territorios que tienen una gran reputación y no son necesariamente los más potentes o las ciudades principales. Ciudad de México no es una ciudad, es una ciudad grande, pero sin embargo no es una ciudad muy bien valorada. Destinos o ciudades o países pequeños hoy en día han empezado a entrar en el juego internacional. Por ejemplo, en el ámbito turístico, Costa Rica es uno de los destinos más valorados de Latinoamérica, y México, que es la principal potencia turística de toda Latinoamérica, ha visto mermar con el paso de los años su imagen. Y lo ha visto mermar, aunque esto no necesariamente le ha afectado de alguna manera al negocio, pero lo acabará haciendo en un plazo de tiempo no demasiado lejano, porque hay una serie de elementos que, como pueden ser los temas de criminalidad, gobernabilidad, etcétera, que han impactado seriamente en sus mercados, con los cuales directamente gestiona la mayor parte de sus negocios, el caso de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Hay otros países que han conseguido mantenerse en estos rankings pese a grandes esfuerzos. Como antes como luego les voy a comentar, por ejemplo, es el caso de Italia, que es un caso bastante interesante de cómo los italianos, en algunos aspectos, desde el punto de vista de la garantía de origen de sus productos, han sabido reaccionar para poder competir en un mercado donde están apareciendo países con productos terriblemente baratos y que compiten, lógicamente, en función de una variable precio. Al final, el modelo que plantea Reputation Institute en el caso de, digamos así, de la medición país, que es el Country Rep Track, sintetiza perfectamente los elementos fundamentales que se deben contemplar a la hora de realizar un marketing de ámbito territorial o incluso un desarrollo territorial. Y me gustaría hacer esta salvedad porque dentro de este concepto de marketing territorial hay dos visiones, dos escuelas, vamos a decir. Una es la americana. Como ustedes saben, en Estados Unidos el Estado tiene un peso relativo en muchas actividades porque se cree fuertemente en la iniciativa privada, con lo cual son muchas veces las empresas privadas las que generan esa dinámica de mercado y el Estado las acompaña. En el caso europeo, gran parte de la construcción europea, de lo que es ahora mismo la Unión Europea, se construyó a base de una política de marketing territorial y de desarrollo territorial que se convirtió en una herramienta de gestión económica y de gestión política. Y esto es una de las opciones que yo creo, en el caso de Latinoamérica, serían fundamentales para poder consolidar el proceso de desarrollo de ámbito local. Al final, todo lo que tiene que ver con marketing territorial tiene que ver con, como decía, una serie de variables que están contempladas en el modelo. La primera, y fundamentalmente, es qué quiero representar para mis clientes finales, o sea, cuál es mi posicionamiento. Y desde un punto de vista de posicionamiento, las grandes riquezas de los territorios, y Perú en este caso no es la excepción, están basados en una serie de elementos diferenciales, sus iconos, incluso su tradición oral, su cultura, su patrimonio, los procesos de revitalización urbana, incluso aquellas imágenes que definen un poco la capacidad, el talento, la innovación y la profesionalidad de las personas que habiten en esos territorios. Aquí hemos visto, tanto a nivel país como a nivel local, a nivel ciudades, cambios fundamentales. La ciudad de Bilbao, cuyo icono hoy probablemente es el Museo Guggenheim, cambió completamente su fisonomía en relación precisamente a una redefinición de la concepción urbana de la ciudad, mucho más pensada para el ciudadano. En el caso, por ejemplo, de Barcelona, que es otro ejemplo paradigmático, Barcelona, cuyo, digamos así, pistoletazo de salida para el cambio fue el optar a las Olimpiadas, realizó también un proceso de desarrollo estratégico y muy importante, con una gran participación ciudadana a través de un concepto que se puso en marcha que se llamaba la Xarxa y que remodeló totalmente el concepto de ciudad. Barcelona era una ciudad que daba las espaldas al mar, era una ciudad industrial y se revitalizó desde el punto de vista urbano. Era una ciudad, diría, inhóspita, desagradable y sucia, como corresponde a una ciudad industrial, y se convirtió en una ciudad de diseño y de ser una ciudad que, a pesar de la mentalidad catalana, que es bastante abierta al extranjero, no era una ciudad turística, se ha convertido hoy probablemente en la primera ciudad turística de España. ¿A quién le ocurre a Barcelona hoy en día? Barcelona está en un proceso incluso de muerte por éxito. O sea, Barcelona ahora mismo se está empezando a preocupar precisamente porque el exceso en el éxito le está generando un problema de reputación a nivel interno y a nivel externo. Y para llegar a este punto, Barcelona ha utilizado los temas, como antes decía, de estructuraciones o de sinergia entre los diferentes stakeholders que están en las ciudades. Utilizó para esto, evidentemente, la inversión del Estado y de la comunidad. Utilizó un evento que fueron las Olimpiadas para poder arrancar, pero luego ha seguido una trayectoria importante donde ha utilizado cualquier herramienta de comunicación que ha estado a su alcance para poder generar esa imagen idílica en el mercado. Y me gustaría contárselo porque es un secreto relativamente. Ustedes, ¿cuántos de ustedes han visto la película Vicky y Cristina Barcelona? Bien. Les voy a contar cómo es la génesis de la película. O sea, ¿qué ocurrió en realidad en la película que nadie les ha contado? Bueno, un buen día se levantó el alcalde de Barcelona y pensó, tenemos que hacer una película para promocionar la ciudad. Lo habló con un productor de cine, amigo suyo. Este contrató a un guionista que yo no diría, vamos a decirlo, un guionista de tipo medio. Vamos a utilizar adecuadamente los objetivos para hacer un guión, agradable, etcétera. Y pensó, teníamos poco presupuesto, pero necesitamos algunas personas que sean capaces de enganchar con el público. Entonces se cogió este productor, se cogió el avión y fue a ver a Woody Allen. Y le dijo, mira, tenemos que hacer una película sobre Barcelona, ya sé que tú haces películas normalmente con tus propios guiones, pero esta es la cifra que te pagaríamos. Y Woody Allen, como buen judío, dijo, perfecto, firmo. Y ya engancharon a Woody Allen. Luego fueron a buscar a Bardem y a Penélope Cruz, que les contaron aquello de eso es un proyecto de ámbito de orgullo local, en fin, ese tipo de cosas, y les convencieron. Y lo que no sé es lo que le contaron a Scarlett Johansson. Bueno, con una película que el guión es un documental de Barcelona, con una temática, vamos a decir, ordinaria o estándar, de repente esta película empieza a hacer taquilla y sobre todo entra en la carrera de los Oscar, gana los Oscar y a partir de ahí se convierte en un fenómeno social. Bueno, pues de este tipo de experiencias tenemos que aprender, de todas las herramientas de comunicación que tenemos a nuestro alcance para generar ese impacto en el cliente. Y al final, cuando un señor viene a visitar un sitio como Perú, por ejemplo, y esto es muy importante que todos los elementos que conforman el territorio estén alineados. O sea, yo no puedo ser un destino competitivo ni desde el punto de vista empresarial, si no tengo una buena logística de transportes, ni lo puedo ser desde el punto de vista turístico si tengo buenos hoteles y tengo un pésimo aeropuerto, por ejemplo. No puedo ser un buen destino turístico si hay unos gaps importantes de calidad entre la oferta de servicios, el tema de medio ambiente. No puedo ser un buen destino turístico o no puedo ser un buen destino para inversiones si no existe una ética de los negocios y una ética del tratamiento al extranjero como parte de esa cultura local. Al final, cuando un señor viene a Perú, desde el punto de vista turístico, lo que se plantea nunca es un desglose de todos estos aspectos que podemos ser capaces de analizar y desarrollar, sino al final lo que piensa en su mente es hace una media de todos estos servicios y se plantea muy sencillamente, me gustó Perú, volveré a Perú, recomiendo Perú. No es una cuestión de si me satisfació Perú, porque al final la satisfacción es una cuestión entre lo que yo esperaba y lo que me dieron. O sea, entre expectativa y satisfacción. Si yo tengo una expectativa baja, pues es fácil tener una satisfacción alta. Al final, esto es una cuestión, insisto, es una cuestión de reputación. Y les pongo un ejemplo de España. España es un valor seguro desde el punto de vista turístico. En la primera columna tienen este es un estudio que realiza la Unión Europea entre los europeos para ver cuáles son los destinos que ellos van a visitar este año. Y entre los tres primeros siempre surge Italia, España, Francia. Evidentemente, en este equilibrio es muy importante la proximidad, pero bueno, tenemos países pues de Oriente Lejano, por ejemplo, que están en esa escala. En la segunda aparecen lo que se llaman los destinos aspiracionales. Es donde me gustaría viajar y luego ya veré si me rasco el bolsillo y tengo dinero suficiente para ir, y luego ya veré si tengo suficientes días de vacaciones para irme, etcétera. Ese tipo de cosas. El hecho de que España esté siempre, España, Francia, Italia, estén siempre en las primeras posiciones del ranking, en el caso de España, le representa que prácticamente el 85% de nuestros visitantes son reiterativos en un plazo medio de 3 años. Y esto es muy importante porque eso nos da una base económica fundamental que en el caso de España representa el 12% del PIB. O sea, el turismo en España, y por eso es un caso de éxito, representa aproximadamente más del doble de lo que representa la media europea. El turismo aporta en España más de lo que aporta en Italia y más de lo que aporta en Francia. Es cierto que eso lo hacemos en base también a un negocio de masa, pero fundamentalmente hemos conseguido mantener la imagen y curiosamente el turismo ha sido de los sectores menos afectados, por ejemplo, por la bajada importante de reputación que ha tenido España en los últimos años. Lo ha sido también, pero comparativamente, en relación a esa bajada, pues no nos hemos visto tan afectados. ¿Pero por qué? Porque España ha conseguido ese hueco en la mente del cliente. Hay otros países que no han tenido tanto éxito. Antes les citaba el caso de México. México, por ejemplo, aparte a nivel país, México tuvo en su época una serie de destinos turísticos de mucho éxito. Le hace el caso de Acapulco. Acapulco fue un destino que se desarrolló sin planificación, se desarrolló porque tiraron de él pues actores de Hollywood, grandes líderes de opinión, y se había convertido en un gran destino de moda. Ellos crecieron sin ningún tipo de criterio, ningún tipo de planificación, y todos los problemas que se han ido generando fundamentalmente de carácter medioambiental han convertido que hoy Acapulco, una vez perdida la reputación que tenía, se haya convertido en un destino que en vez de ser un destino de primer nivel a escala internacional como lo era, hoy en día es un destino de fin de semana para el público de Ciudad de México. Por lo tanto, ha cambiado dramáticamente su perspectiva y, por lo tanto, todos los países, en función de su histórico, de su tradición, en función de la calidad de los productos, en función de la experticia que ellos pueden demostrar en el mercado e incluso del valor de las marcas, por lo tanto, hay una relación natural entre reputación empresas, reputación territorios, en ambos sentidos. O sea, un territorio con buena reputación suele tener empresas bien reputadas y unas empresas con buena reputación ayudan a potenciar la imagen del territorio. En función de esos elementos de diferenciación y en función de cómo genera esos valores sociales, pues ocupa ese posicionamiento. Entonces, hoy en día cuando pensamos en un producto de fiabilidad, pensamos en Alemania. Cuando pensamos en un producto de diseño, pensamos en Italia. ¿Italia qué hizo en los últimos años? Hizo una cuestión que era muy importante y entendió que como no podía competir en precio, tenía que concentrarse en el core business de su negocio. Por ejemplo, en el mundo de la moda, no sé si saben que casi todos los grandes diseñadores italianos utilizan los mismos patronistas y compran los lotes de telas y la fabricación de las telas de manera conjunta. Y luego hacen el diseño de manera individual, que es donde ellos pueden competir. ¿Eso qué les ha permitido? Les ha permitido rebajar sustancialmente sus costes y, a pesar de ser más caros que la media, sí poder ser todavía muy competitivos y poder mantenerse. España es un concepto de país turístico y, por ejemplo, hay países que luego sectorialmente, como es el caso de Japón, todavía se le identifica como un país, por ejemplo, donde es muy importante el tema tecnológico, aunque hay otros países, como puede ser el caso de Corea, con productos ya, tanto en el ámbito de la automoción como en el tecnológico, que son muy competitivos. Perú ya desde hace tiempo está trabajando en ese concepto de ser el destino gastronómico de Latinoamérica. Pero, ojo, y esto es muy importante, trabajar o quererme posicionar como destino gastronómico no significa necesariamente solo tener buenos recursos y buena materia prima y no es solamente tener buenos restaurantes. En España tenemos quizás el cocinero más popular, que es... otra vez me quedo con los nombres. ¡Ay! Un día voy a llegar a casa y voy a etiquetar a mis hijos, porque si no los voy a confundir. Bueno, pues Perú quiere. Bueno, pues ¿por qué España es vista como una potencia gastronómica? No solo por la calidad de la cocina, sino porque España tiene el 42% del mercado mundial de patentes gastronómicas. Y esto es muy importante si queremos desarrollar y queremos posicionarnos como un destino, como un país, por ejemplo, destacado por el tema gastronómico. Luego, en relación a la marca es la diferencia entre un iPod y un MP3. Esta es la definición que más me gusta y es muy clara. Al final estamos hablando de diferentes productos, de productos equiparables, pero con funcionalidades y con imagen y con una cultura de cara al cliente que los distingue. Perú ha sido capaz, en muy poco tiempo, desde el desarrollo de la marca Perú, en convertirse en la segunda marca más prestigiada de Latinoamérica. Cuando comparado con otros países de parecidas características, no han conseguido, a pesar de haber hecho grandes esfuerzos en un plano económico, en un plano técnico y en un plano de empuje, incluso de políticas de Estado, no han sido capaces de conseguir el mismo nivel. Yo diría el gran éxito de la marca Perú ha sido hacer una cosa que es muy diferente, muy difícil, que es enganchar primero con el público nacional. Ha sido capaz de convertirse en un icono, un símbolo. A mí todavía me sorprende que veo un mensajero y lleva el logotipo de la marca Perú. Me voy a un restaurante en alguna ciudad de Latinoamérica, incluso un restaurante humilde, y pone restaurante peruano, la marca Perú. Este sentimiento de apoyo nacional ha sido muy importante, incluso empezando de una manera, no iba a decir tímida, sino muy amable, con esa primera campaña que se hizo de Perú Nebraska, y se ha ido convirtiendo en un caso de estudio a nivel internacional porque han sido capaz de conectar con el mercado. Al final, las marcas las crea el mercado, no las crean los diseñadores de marcas. Entonces, es un punto muy importante. Y a este efecto han acompañado aspectos como cuidado del entorno, como un momento dulce de la economía y, por supuesto, también un gobierno pues más o menos estable. Al final, cuando hablamos de desarrollo territorial, hablamos de un proceso de desarrollo. Y si yo quiero entender un territorio, quiero pensar que un territorio es, en el fondo, un sistema de oferta y demanda y, por lo tanto, una empresa virtual. Y, por lo tanto, la tengo que gestionar de la misma manera. Si quiero atraer negocios, tengo que construir clústeres para ser competitivo. Si quiero atraer talento, tengo que ofrecer calidad de vida, tengo que ofrecer posibilidades a los locales. Si quiero atraer turismo, y este es un caso muy claro para Perú, debo atender segmentos, porque desde luego Perú no es un destino masivo. Y si quiero atraer inversión, tengo que ofrecer oportunidades. Muchos territorios, caso por ejemplo de Victoria, han sabido, a pesar de tener pocos recursos, han sabido posicionarse. Victoria es un proyecto que trabajamos nosotros hace tiempo, se ha convertido en la capital ecológica de Europa. Fue premiada por ello. Vigo, que es otra ciudad en la que trabajamos, es la capital pesquera de toda Europa. Y de hecho, yo sé que las grandes industrias pesqueras de aquí van a Vigo como un sitio referente para entrar en el mercado europeo. Al final, desde el punto de vista reputacional, los éxitos o los fracasos de los territorios no son fruto de la casualidad. El hecho de que España perdiera la última opción para ser, para residir los Juegos Olímpicos, no ha sido fruto de la casualidad, ha sido fruto de no cumplir con determinados parámetros vinculados a la reputación, en este caso a la económica, que le han venido afectando. Y aquí voy a terminar mi reflexión, porque ya me están dando el preaviso, bueno, el segundo aviso, y es muy sencillo. Es muy sencillo. Desde el modelo de reputation se puede ver perfectamente la correlación que existe entre la reputación y los ingresos por turismo. Bueno, esta correlación viene definida por esta fórmula, por estos índices matemáticos, que básicamente vienen a decir de una manera muy sencillita: si Perú consigue subir su índice de reputación un puntito, que cuesta, hay que trabajárselo, esto no es gratis, por ejemplo, el año que viene, esto representaría de alguna manera, y siempre y cuando los datos que se ofrecen por las administraciones públicas peruanas, por Perú, Mincetur, etcétera, son correctos, representaría que podría generar un 0,5% más de los ingresos por turismo en el país. Esto es subir un puntito de reputación cuando generamos 3 billones de dólares por ingresos de turismo, representaría para el Perú nada más que 15.000 millones de dólares más en sus arcas. Lo cual no está nada mal, ¿no? Yo lo dejaría como un proceso de reflexión para ver si realmente entendemos que valorar, trabajar en la reputación de los territorios también es un impacto económico fundamental para el desarrollo de nuestros países. Gracias.
Pueden pasar al hall principal para un coffee break. Luego del receso regresamos para continuar con el programa y presentar los resultados del estudio sobre reputación corporativa.